Good evening and welcome to The Report with me, Jonathan Steele. In tonight's programme, we'll be looking at the day's top stories, as well as a report on South Sudan's warring factions who've made a new agreement to hold talks. We'll also be discussing Prime Minister David Cameron's decision to dismiss the warnings by José Manuel Barroso, the outgoing President of the European Commission, that he is pursuing a risky anti-EU agenda. But first, as Yemen's security crisis deepens, the UN has announced it will impose sanctions on ex-President Ali Abdullah Saleh, his son, and 3 Houthi leaders. Flaminia Jambalvo has more on this story.
The UN is preparing to impose sanctions on 5 prominent Yemenis, including Ali Abdullah Saleh, the former president. This move follows stark criticisms made by the Security Council on the recent wave of unrests.
The members of the Security Council also condemned the continued attacks against Yemeni security forces in Hadramaut on October 9, as well as in Baida on October 8, aimed at undermining Yemen's stability.
3 of those named to be sanctioned are leaders of the Houthi rebel group that has seized large parts of the country over the past month. Saleh, whose 30-year reign ended in 2012 after a popular uprising, has been accused of using Yemen's ongoing crisis to re-establish his influence over its political scene. Meanwhile, on the ground in Yemen, southern secessionists revealed plans to rejuvenate their push to secession.
الجنوب من هذه الفعالية هي إرسال رسالة للعالم أن العصابات المتصارعة في صنعاء لا يمكن أن تقرر مستقبل شعب الجنوب، مستقبل شعب الجنوب يقرره من هذا المكان وهو ماض الآن من أجل استعادة الدولة وتحرير الجنوب من هذه العصابات ومن الاحتلال اليمني المحلل.
The southern movement hoped to exploit a political vacuum created by the Houthis to advance their cause. At the same time, they're being spurred on by fears that the Houthis could soon expand into the once independent south. On October 14, the southern secessionists held their biggest ever rally in Aden with around 100,000 people attending the event at Al Arad Square. Secessionists then released a statement demanding independence from a 24-year-old union with the north. They set the 30th of November as a deadline for a response from Sana'a. The uprising of Houthi rebels has reignited a number of sectarian tensions, which have been present in the country for decades. In the absence of a clear response from central government, the country seems at a stalemate between civil war and dissolution.
Well, joining me by Skype to discuss this is Asil Sidahmad, Deputy Country Manager for Yemen at Persists, a development consultancy organization based in Beirut. And on the phone, Belkis Willie, who is Yemen researcher at Human Rights Watch. Welcome to you both. Let me start with you, Asil, if I may. I mean, these accusations that the former president is behind a lot of this Houthi unrest, is there much foundation to that?
I think that's an interesting question. It's certainly what's on everyone's lips right now. Originally, a couple of weeks ago, when the peace agreement was signed between the Houthis and the government, the idea was that a prime minister would be appointed within 3 days. And he'd sort of told the Houthis that they could stay in the capital city so long as the prime minister was actually announced. When the prime minister wasn't announced, they continued to stay. But just last week, the prime minister, a new prime minister that everyone agreed on, was announced, and the Houthis have continued to stay in Sana'a, even though they are starting to let go of some of the checkpoints that they had control over in the capital city. So on the one hand, it seems like Hadi is trying not to spark tensions with the Houthis and trying to approach things in a sort of compromised manner. On the other hand, it seems that he told the governor of Hodeidah when the Houthis entered Hodeidah that the governor of Hodeidah should allow the Houthis to enter, to take over checkpoints, and even to take over some military bases, which would suggest that there might be some underhand deal going on. It seemed a bit clearer in July when Islah and the Houthis were in combat in Amran and in other parts of the country, particularly Al Jouf, that it served President Hadi's interests that the Houthis would help him balance out the control that the Islah Party has in the country.
But you mentioned the issue of the prime minister. I mean, did the Houthis expect that one of their people would become prime minister? Is that why they're still upset?
It's not. It's my belief, and I think that a lot of people might disagree with what I'm saying, is that the Houthis' real agenda in Yemen is to have control over a separate federal state in northern Yemen, which was one of the outcomes of the national dialogue. They currently will be part of a federal state called Sabah, which would include Amran and Sana'a, and it would be landlocked with Saudi on the other side. And they want to have access to a port. So I think ministerial positions are not really high on their agenda. It's more of a bargaining chip that they would use. But they seem to be quite happy with the most recent appointment of the prime minister. They weren't happy with the first one. So I think their interest is having people who won't block them or won't exclude them from the political process. Okay,
that's good. Let's now hear from Belkis, who's actually in Aden. And we showed on that video these huge demonstrations that were recently in Aden talking about southern secession. Belkis, are these really the biggest such demonstrations for many years, or is it sort of almost a routine thing?
Over the last years and really since the civil war in '94, there have been regular demonstrations by members of the Southern Movement. Within the Southern Movement, there are different factions, some calling for independence, some calling for greater autonomy, some calling for more financial benefit coming from national resources in the South, and some more complacent with the status quo and the current centralized government. I think during the national dialogue, one saw a very interesting alliance being forged between the Houthis and the Southern Movement, and they realized that they both had common interests. And I think what you've now seen with this show of force of the Houthis in the north is this notion that it would be the perfect time for the Southerners to, for once and for all, call for independence, because they have gotten the sensation from certain Houthi leaders that solution would potentially be accepted by the Houthis, and would be talking about a northern state ruled by the Houthis and a southern state ruled by the Southerners, so two separate countries. So I think that's why you're seeing so many people right now turning out to protest in the South and making that call. Whether that ultimately is realistic and could happen is a different story.
Well, I mean, would that be the majority view? If you take the Houthis and the Southerners together, do they have a majority? I mean, could they force that through to make a new federal constitution?
I mean, ultimately, I think, again, it gets back to this issue that within the Houthis, but particularly within the Southerners, there are different factions within the movement. And some are incredibly concerned about the implications of independence, particularly at the economic level, but also because you have a centralized government in Sana'a. At this point, there are no governmental institutions in the South that would be able to step in and create a state. So I'm not sure that one can say that the majority want this. What I do think is that the majority of Southerners right now feel like it is a very good time to air their grievances and to start making demands, because right now the government is incredibly weak, and they do have a certain amount of an overture from the Houthis. So there is this moment for them to start making demands, whether it's in independence or greater autonomy.
Asil, let me come back to you. I mean, there was a national dialogue that lasted for 2 years or so, where all these things were meant to be thrashed out. And then the national dialogue was completed, and now we've got this violence. Doesn't that show that the dialogue itself was a bit of a farce all along?
That's certainly how a lot of civil society activists are feeling right now, especially on the ground. But I think there was that sentiment in some factions, even throughout the process. Particularly with the Iraq movement, a lot of people felt that the members on the National Dialogue Committee that were supposed to represent Southern interests weren't hardcore Iraq enough, and some of them were dubbed as Hadi's Iraq, because, as you know, President Hadi is from the South, but he was generally viewed by Southerners as someone who betrayed the North. So even by the end of the national dialogue, there wasn't an overwhelming sense of buy-in from Southerners in the political transition process, because they felt that it didn't properly represent their views. Iraq activists and youth that I spoke to around that time felt quite disillusioned with the process. And they weren't just disillusioned with the national dialogue, they were also becoming quite disillusioned with Iraq and all of the internal divisions. On the side of the Houthis made a lot of gains as a result of the national dialogue. I mean, before the national dialogue, the language that was used to describe the Houthis was simply a rebel movement that was seen as a threat to the state. Throughout the national dialogue, they formed a political, let's say the political wing, which isn't formalized as a party yet, Ansar Allah. This gave them a greater sense of legitimacy, and because they weren't seen as spoiling the process, they were actually making, as Belkis pointed out, strong alliances, particularly with the South. So by the end of the national dialogue process, we saw a reshuffling of the political economy in Yemen. But one thing that was really sad to see this year is that civil society organizations who'd actually enjoyed quite a lot of voice throughout the process have now receded into the background, and we've returned to the type of political games that we saw in Ali Abdullah Saleh's heyday.
What about the actual sort of control of the streets in Sana'a? I mean, that seems to me a bit of a mystery, because the army is still in place. The army hasn't sort of fled like what has happened in Iraq, in the north of Iraq. So how come the Houthis have taken over? I mean, what does he mean, taken over? Are they in charge of security? Are they in charge of the barracks? Are they giving orders to the army? What does it actually mean?
Well, up until yesterday, for the last couple of weeks, what it meant was that they controlled the checkpoints that are all around the city. Now, the checkpoints are intended to sort of control movement and to improve security in the city, to prevent terrorist attacks and etc. But the checkpoints prior to that were seen as somewhat, unfortunately, corrupt and not really able to provide effective security. So since the Houthis came into the city, there are mixed reviews from civilians. Some civilians are of the opinion that the Houthi checkpoints are much more professional than the ones from the Ministry of Interior and the Special Security Forces, and that they were helping to manage security quite well in the city, whilst others felt actually quite frightened by it and insecure. So people have been reporting that the cities are quite empty. They've also...
Asil, I'm sorry to cut into you. I just wanted to give Belkis one more chance to speak. We've only got a couple of minutes left, and that's really to take on a big issue of the women's role. I mean, in the national dialogue, a lot of space was given to women to express their point of view and so on. I mean, has anything remained of all that, or what we see now is a lot of armed men rushing around and demonstrating? I mean, has the women's thing been pushed onto the back burner once again?
So I think the national dialogue, as you said, did give a platform to discuss certain women's rights issues that have until then been considered taboo. And actually, the realities of what's happened since the end of the national dialogue with regards to the security of the state, the future structure of Yemen as a federal state, all of that has potentially gone out of the window because of these developments with the Houthis coming into Sana'a and now being able to sort of renegotiate fundamental elements. However, I do think the one area where the national dialogue was effective was in doing just that, raising women's rights issues that had been taboo. And suddenly now, I mean, you see it in a range of ways, including, the media covering certain very, very sensitive women's rights issues in op-eds, in discussions, in articles, trying to bring these issues to the fore. And we as Human Rights Watch are actually trying to capitalize on that. So many issues right now, human rights issues, are politicized and very hard to work on and very hard to have impact on. When it comes to women's rights issues, right now, we see a much greater opportunity for impact because they're one of the few areas that we're working on that are not politicized.
Well, on that slightly hopeful note, we'll have to end it. Thank you very much for your participation. Let's take a look now at the rest of today's top stories.